My interest in how children learn started a long time ago. I've got 4 children. They all had wonderful teachers. 3 of them learnt, but my older daughter could not learn. She worked hard, she tried hard. And I was up in the north of England one day and I got a phone call, the kind of phone call that no parent ever wants to get. And it was to say that my eldest daughter had attempted to take her life. I was given no more information. I was just told to rush to the hospital that was 2 hours away. So on that 2-hour journey, everything that was going through my mind was all about what else could I have tried? What didn't I do? What advice could I have sought that I didn't seek? She'd been told things like, she's got to learn to live with it. And she just announced to the world that the symptoms that she had got were not worth living with. And it started that first lesson that with neurodiversity often comes mental health issues, and no one seemed to be working away at understanding why this was happening. So the advice she was getting about learning to live with it, obviously that didn't get her very far. I was running several successful businesses, and I decided on that 2-hour journey, if she was to live, then I was to make my life purpose finding out why Susie could not learn. I got to the hospital and I was greeted by my younger daughter who said, they think she's coming around, there's hope. Well, that was thrilling, but my life had changed. So for the last 25 years, all I've done is worked with neuroscientists and others around the world to find out why is it that some children learn and some don't. The assumption generally is that there's nothing we can do about the level of intelligence we're born with. Whatever we have between our ears, we have to live with that. Well, I now know that that's not true. So there's some really exciting stuff to share with you. And one of the very exciting things that I've learned is that often it's the brightest, it's those with the most intelligence that end up showing signs of neurodiversity. How can that be? How can it be that people that struggle at school, some of them go on to become incredibly successful in their entrepreneurial life or their business life? What's happening? What are we getting wrong? Why is it that education isn't measuring, isn't developing intelligence? We've got a system that's absolutely brilliant at teaching. I'm a huge fan of teachers. In fact, I own a couple of private schools, so I'm very much into teaching. And what I've discovered is that teachers simply are not taught to identify the symptoms of neurodiversity. They are brilliant at getting information across, rather like filling a bucket with knowledge and information and inspiring them. But what they're not given is the tools to find out why is it some children simply cannot take in information. They don't find reading easy. Their listening processing isn't fully developed. They can't concentrate for long. So getting information in and getting information out is very hard for probably more than 25% of children. Is that teachers' fault? Absolutely not. Is it parents' fault? No, it's absolutely not. Are the children being lazy? Absolutely not. In fact, the irony is that children that have signs of neurodiversity are actually working much harder than others. So please never let anyone accuse a child of being lazy unless they're absolutely certain that that's what it is. But if there's neurodiversity there, those children are working hard. And I'm going to explain why in a few moments why that is. And if children have got any signs of poor attention, if they've got symptoms of ADHD, whether they've been diagnosed or not, those children are working hard because it's not the appropriate part of the brain that's doing a lot of the processing. And I'm going to go into a bit of neuroscience in a minute, because what has been discovered decades ago still isn't reaching the education system. And who's suffering? Our children are suffering as a consequence. So what I'm going to share with you is crucially important to the educational success and the happiness and the performance of children right through their lives. So do you think children with neurodiversity are choosing not to read? Are they choosing not to concentrate? Absolutely not. Are they choosing to misbehave? No, they're not. They're wired to not pay attention. They're wired not to be able to read easily. They're wired not to be able to behave appropriately. This is not a choice they're making. So when children are severely criticized for things they have no influence over, imagine how unfair that is. Imagine how the child feels, the confusion the child feels. He or she sees everybody else in the class doing things well, doing things easily, and they're trying hard, and everything they try and do is wrong. And what's worse, it's criticized. And what's even worse, they're often punished for the very things that they're wired up to be. That's scary. And yet it's gone on for decades. And the neuroscience that could explain all of this is not reaching the very teachers. So I often speak to teachers. I was talking to one this week, and I was saying to her, she's a great teacher, by the way, and I was saying to her, how much training did you get at teacher training school on the whole subject of neurodiversity? She said it was less than half a day. Wow. So I then went on to ask her, so what proportion of your one-to-one time with children do you spend on those children with neurodiversity? And she said, oh, it's almost all of it. It was the 80-20 rule, in fact, and she was saying 80% of my time I spent one-to-one with those children that are struggling. So 80% of her precious one-to-one time was being spent on those children that she'd had no training about. Not just no training, but no tools. It's rather like being brilliant at filling a bucket with a fire hose, but having no tools to repair the holes in the bucket. That's how serious this situation is. We've got about 25% of children, so typically 1 in 4 will struggle to some degree with reading. You know, it's a fact to this day. I'm a board member of the Reach Institute in America, which is an amazing charity training teachers how to understand these children and deal with them better. And so the data that I'm getting, the statistics I'm getting, is scary. Since COVID lockdown, the already serious level of child anxiety has multiplied. Yes, multiplied. We're in a situation where the resources available to help children that have got signs of depression or anxiety, just like my daughter had, they've always been inadequate. You know, I see child psychologists, child psychiatrists and others working very, very hard. They know they haven't got enough time to reach children. I hear complaints from teachers and from parents saying, this child was diagnosed with serious anxiety many months ago. There's still no sign of there being available a trained mental health professional to see them. Hence what happened to my daughter. Hence my concern. And what I've learned from neuroscientists around the world is that you can do the things to increase mental strength. Wow. We thought mental health was all about negative problems and what can we do to minimize those problems? What sticking plasters can we put on them to deal with it? And we assume that medication is the only solution for many of these things. Well, medication is amazing what it can do. But so you imagine if the very way we think about physical health, we think about it as eating properly, exercising properly, being strong and fit and healthy physically. You imagine if we could also have that concept applied to mental health. So we could think about creating mental strength, creating mental robustness, mental resilience, mental capacity. The neuroscience is there to do all of these things. And if you imagine that being applied to children, so that teachers had the tools to repair the holes in the bucket that they're trying to fill, and they're amazing at filling. But you imagine being able to identify what is it that causes children to have limitations in learning? What is it that causes them to have limitations in their ability to read, to take in information, to listen, to concentrate for long periods? What difference would that make to your child? What difference maybe would it have made to you if throughout your school life you were able to sit there calmly, be organized, be structured, listening, taking in information, reading effortlessly? Because there's 1 in 4 children at least that cannot do that, and we're doing nothing about it. We do amazing things in the universe, but we've been ignoring the serious issues of those children that are misunderstood and missing out on the precious days and years of their school experience. What I'm trying to share with you is some of the breakthroughs that have been in neuroscience in the last 30 years that still hasn't reached the education system. So it means that at least one generation is suffering needlessly. We've got to put that right. And the education system to this day is showing very little interest in the neuroscience. In fact, it seems like there's a void. We've got education, we've got psychology, we've got psychiatry, and we've got the whole medical system all surrounding the void that's in the middle, and that is what creates mental strength, what creates the ability to learn. So one of my missions is to change the education system so that teachers are given the tools. Teachers are given wonderful ability to teach, but they now need to be given the tools to measure the ability to learn or lack of, and the tools to address that. You might say, oh, that's a developmental issue. Yes, but if teachers are the first to see it and realize that there's something going wrong here, why couldn't they be given the tools to address this? We could transform the next generation. We can transform the present generation. You know, when I look at the money that's spent on NASA and all sorts of projects, I'm not against that, but a fraction of that money directed to the education system to give teachers the tools, to give parents the tools, would transform the next generation, because the issues of mental health start early. Almost all aspects of neurodiversity starts from a trauma somewhere. It could be a trauma during pregnancy. And when I use the word trauma, I'm using it in the neuroscience sense. In other words, whenever that baby or that young child's brain has something happening to it that its brain can't cope with, doesn't know the outcome of, that's a trauma. Anything surprising that happens. So it's not just what parents do wrong when they're not nurturing a child properly. It's those accidental things that happen, the bad health, the shock that the mother has, the fact that the father was a soldier and had to go off to war when the child was just a few weeks old. You know, there's countless numbers of things that create concerns for that young baby, that young child, sometimes still in the womb, sometimes at birth, the cord around the neck or issues like that. All sorts of things where that child's brain could not predict the outcome, can create a trauma. The trouble is, when that happens, that trauma can stunt the development of the very bit of the brain that hardwires all of those circuits that makes life easy for us, or not, as the case may be. So trauma during pregnancy, at birth, during the early months or even years of a child's life can stunt the development of the cerebellum. The cerebellum largely is developed by about the age of 7. So anything that happens before that age, when the child cannot work out what's happening, is likely to do 3 things. First of all, it stunts the development of the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is a bit like a room full of computer coders, and it creates all of the automatic processes that we need to make life easy. So I'll just give you one example. Reading depends upon our eye tracking being smooth. So when we're trying to read, all the letters and words must go in the proper order so that the brain can see what's happening and you can read effortlessly. For the vast majority of those children that struggle with reading, and I'm talking about 1 in 4, right through to adult life, don't find reading easy. For them, that skill that the cerebellum, that room full of computer coders, should have automatized, it has never been developed. So instead of their eyes smoothly tracking, the very automatic process that the cerebellum should have created so that eyes track smoothly has not been created. So those children's eyes jump around. Sometimes their eyes are going backwards when it should be going forward. So guess what? They write and see letters backwards or upside down. So you can watch this on a video. This would be a wonderful tool that every teacher should have in every school to find out what's the root cause of this child's struggles with reading. I mean, there's been, for decades now, there's been focus on phonics. Phonics is critical. Phonics is critical up to about the age of 7. I've never met a child that hasn't had good phonics taught to them by their teachers by the age of 7. What is needed after that is perfect eye tracking. And that eye tracking is a skill that's developed by the cerebellum. So the cerebellum does all sorts of things for our balance and physical movement, but it also influences the development of our emotional controls and other cognitive processes. It coordinates everything. So if a child has a trauma that stunts the development of that master junction box in the brain, the cerebellum, then all sorts of underdevelopment can happen. So that's the first thing that can happen from a trauma. The second thing that can happen from a trauma is that you end up with triggers. And I'm talking about things that cause us to behave irrationally, puts us into fight or flight sometimes, or maybe it's phobias, or it just makes us hugely anxious. All of those things are created by triggers that emanated from a trauma at some point. So a child that has situations in his or her early life where the brain can't work out what's happening, they develop a propensity for anxiety. And those folk go right through their life responding adversely to all sorts of things that weren't really a threat, and they are creating false alarms all the time. They live in a highly anxious state, glass half empty state. So the propensity for that starts very early, and it's called trait anxiety. So trait anxiety is things happened during pregnancy, at birth, in early months or years of a child's life, where the brain couldn't work out what was happening. So almost like the thermostat was set to expect the world to be a dangerous place, have this negative view on everything that happens. And as you go through life, you respond adversely to all sorts of things that weren't really a threat to your life, but the false alarms kept going off. The anxiety was there. And since COVID, what we're seeing is very large numbers of children have high levels of anxiety to the point where they don't learn very much. Is that teacher's fault? No. Is it their fault or their parents' fault? It's actually not. It's the understanding of the mechanism in the brain that creates high levels of anxiety. But it gets worse than that, because what anxiety does is anxiety floods the brain with cortisol. That's something that stops the brain from working. It prepares you for fight and flight. It's saying nothing else matters right now. There's a threat around, probably a false alarm, but the brain thinks it's a threat. And all of this happens in your unconscious mind. So it's not telling you this is why you're worried, this is why you're anxious. It's just preparing you for something that actually is not going to happen. But that anxiety stops the brain from learning. So if you've got a child that really hates school, is scared of school, the fact is that child is probably not going to learn very much. Not because he or she isn't intelligent and capable of learning, it's because whenever they're anxious, whenever they're unhappy, the brain is full of cortisol and learning just isn't going to happen. Why don't we understand that? Why don't we put more focus on schools being very safe places? You know, we focus hard on that fire hose going into the bucket, but we don't focus on what's the neurology of the ability to learn. These are really seriously important topics. And boy, do I wish I knew when Susie was young all of this stuff. Her life would have been very, very different. Thankfully, she's alive and happy to this day. That's a mercy. But boy, if I had known this, and when I share this with teachers, they love it because it gives them a huge understanding. When I share it with parents, it's like suddenly shining a light on the understanding of why is my child like this? And if you think that 1 in 4 children underperform in reading, 1 in 6 or 7 have attention issues, that's the level of neurodiversity that exists today, and there is something we can do about it. So it's really important to look out for when children are underperforming. If they're struggling with reading, but they're showing some other signs of intelligence, there's probably a neurological reason why reading isn't easy for them. Let's identify it. So, we talk about neurodiversity. It's not a term I love because it kind of doesn't really focus on what the real challenges are. It can show itself with poor reading, poor concentration. For some, it will show itself as a kind of physical clumsiness, so we call it DCD or dyspraxia. That is when the cerebellum, that room full of coders, hasn't done the job of perfectly coordinating balance and movement. It's something that can be put right, but it's often not diagnosed appropriately. Shyness, Asperger's, where someone can't read body language, or shyness where someone can't get out the wonderful thoughts they've got inside. These are all signs of underdevelopment of the cerebellum. Cerebellum's only small, by the way. It's only 10% of the volume of the brain, but it's got 3/4 of all of our brain cells. It's incredibly important and been totally misunderstood. It was only about 25 or 30 years ago when professors from Sheffield University and Harvard University were saying, do you know what? It's doing far more than ever we thought. So if you're a medic or if you're interested in education, study the cerebellum, because you'll discover some incredible things that explain so much about why some children find things easy and some don't. Why 3 of my children found things easy to learn, but my daughter didn't. So this is really important stuff. So getting an understanding of what causes the cerebellum to be itself underdeveloped and skills to be underdeveloped and the problems that cause is critical. Getting an understanding about how trauma can create triggers. So any aspect of irrational behavior, if a child becomes upset when he or she shouldn't be upset, if they get angry, if they get anxious when they shouldn't really be, it's because of trauma. But there's a third thing that trauma in early childhood can cause, and that is sometimes it creates genius. Wow! Does that really explain why so many that underperform in school go on to be incredibly wealthy and successful in business? Does it explain why ADHD often comes with genius? The problem with ADHD is, there's lots of problems with the term ADHD, and the most famous person in the world who understands ADHD is Dr. Ned Hallowell. He's written some amazing books. I think he's sold over 5 million books. But his focus is on the positives that those with ADHD have. Most people, when you say ADHD, they immediately think about the negatives. Oh, they can't concentrate, they can't behave, they can't do this, they can't do that. Dr. Hallowell says, no, focus on the positives. Focus on the fact that these are folk, often when they're in later life, they will go on to be hugely successful, because they can think outside the box. They don't think and behave like the rest of us think. They're creative, hugely creative. So why is it that trauma can create creativity, can create genius? Well, we think it's because if a child, even a baby, that's trying to cope with things that are happening that he or she can't make sense of, from a very early age, they're having to learn to think outside the box. They're having to try and find solutions that they shouldn't have to look for. You know, a child that's completely, perfectly nurtured doesn't have to think about anything. It's all there provided for him and her until they're old enough to make decisions for themselves. So through no fault of the parents or the child, of course, any form of trauma, any form of situation which the child's brain can't make sense of will develop a degree of creativity. And that can make a massive difference to their life. But understanding this makes an enormous difference to how that child could be treated. So all of the potential they have, all their creativity can be maximized, can be made much of. So the children that go through school just being criticized for ADHD are much more likely to fail in life. Those that have got support, those that have got understanding about the strengths that they've got, are much more likely to have a very successful life. So what about the whole diagnosis process? I've got a thing about diagnosis. I think we do it badly. In fact, I think the whole diagnosis process that's happening right now should be torn up. We should start again. Now the neuroscience is there explaining what causes these symptoms, what causes these limitations, what causes these challenges to children. They're all linked to incomplete development of key parts of the brain. I argue strongly that before any diagnosis happens, you study what has happened to the development and is there something we can do to continue that development and complete it. Because once a diagnosis happens, it's like a tattoo across the forehead. I've seen lots of children like that, and they become adults, and even later in life they have a kind of learnt helplessness. Oh no, I was diagnosed dyslexic. as if I've got an excuse not to try. No one's going to expect anything of me because I'm dyslexic. And guess what? That does them huge harm. The supportive parent, the supportive teacher, will make sure that that child's strengths are focused on. If you've got a child that you think needs to be diagnosed, think first, what can I do to identify any developmental delay that there is? What can I do to complete that? Because I want to get rid of any and all of the symptoms that that child has before the diagnosis machine kicks in. Because otherwise you're tragically labeling that child with something that might be totally unfair, totally inappropriate, and going to hamper them right through their lives. Don't give them that tattoo unless you absolutely have to. Now, some will argue, oh yeah, unless I get a diagnosis, I can't get help from the local authority. Okay, I understand that. But if you at all can, please consider, has there been some trauma? Whether you can identify or not, has there been some delay in development? What can I do about that? And only then, and only if you have to, go to the diagnosis process. So what I'm observing is that many children that had been diagnosed, when you continue and complete the development, and we now know from neuroscience, you can do that with all sorts of stimulatory exercises. You can give exercises to the child that stimulate the brain in the same way it was being stimulated when they were crawling as an early child. So crawling is a critical phase. I've met so many mums. I met one only a couple of weeks ago, and she was so proud that her son had bypassed crawling. Oh, he was walking around the furniture at 9 months. Oh, how fantastic was that? And what was happening was, because he bypassed a critical development stage that crawling is, some of the links between the left and right side of the brain did not develop to the extent they should have done. And as a result, that child's coordination of all sorts of things was missed. He was highly creative, very clever in some respects, but fundamental things like reading was not a possibility for him. His eye tracking was dreadful. His auditory processing hadn't developed. And you know what happens? This is really important stuff. If the development of the cerebellum hasn't been completed, then key skills never become automatic. So if you imagine when you were learning to ride a bike, you knew what to do, you were thinking about it, and you were falling off. And then as you learnt what you were thinking about, you no longer had to think about. Why? Because the role of the cerebellum is to take what you're thinking and turn it into an automatic process that happens up here in your cortex, automatically without you thinking. In fact, you can only ride a bike when you don't have to think. That's because the cerebellum has completed its job, turned what you were thinking about to balance and lean over and pedal and brake and all of those things. When that was fully automatized, so you don't have to learn it, you can do it, and only then can you do it. But the trouble is, about 1 in 6 of our key skills never fully develops, never becomes automatic, because the cerebellum itself wasn't developed enough to do its job properly. So if reading is a struggle, then it's because the eye tracking isn't smooth. The eyes are jumping instead of smoothly going along. Is that lack of intelligence? Absolutely not. Is it laziness? Absolutely not. Is it bad parenting or bad teaching? No. It's just incomplete development of something neurological. So the process that's been developed is to complete the development of the cerebellum so that that room full of computer coders can naturally, automatically, and permanently complete the fundamental skills to make learning easy, to make reading easier, to make concentration easier. So when a skill is underdeveloped, and we'll focus on eye tracking for a moment, then the prefrontal cortex, that's the thinking brain, gets very busy helping out, rather like it had to when you were learning to ride a bike. But for many, they go through their lives with an incompletely developed ability to move their eyes smoothly, and their thinking brain is busy doing stuff it shouldn't have to be doing, just to try and help them move their eyes so that they can read. When the thinking brain does it, it's not very skilled at it. It's not automatic. So it's hard work. So it's clumsy and clunky, and the letters going backwards and upside down and all sorts of things. So the thinking brain isn't good at helping out with skills that should be automatic. But worse than that, you don't just have a poor skill. you have this part of the brain full of stuff that shouldn't be there. This is where you think. This is where you make decisions. This is where you organize. This is where you control your emotions. You control impulsivity. And it's where your inhibitory control is. So just one example of inhibitory control. When you see people shaking their leg and they can't stop shaking their leg, that's lack of inhibitory control. When you see a child or an adult losing emotional control, it's because they've run out of space here. If you've got a child that keeps forgetting to take things to school, or is disorganized, or is shambolic, or has a poor short-term memory, it's because this part of their brain, their thinking brain, is full of stuff that shouldn't be there. They're not choosing to behave like that. They're wired to behave like that. So it all starts with the trauma that stunted the development of the cerebellum, and that room full of coders wasn't able to finish its job, so you get some poor skills like poor reading or poor concentration. You know, with concentration, we often say of children, you can see her cogs whirring. What we mean is, instead of what's going in through the ears automatically goes to comprehended thought that they can make sense of, they have to go through an extra process where, in their thinking brain, they have to work hard at listening. And the trouble is, whatever you have to do here, whenever this part of the brain is having to help out with fundamental skills, this is typically 100,000 times slower than up here. Yeah, you got that right. At least 100,000 times slower. Some neuroscience argue it's 1,000,000 times slower. But it's incredibly slow and incredibly hard compared to it being effortless. So the child that's struggling with concentration, that people are thinking is he or she ADHD, that child is actually working much, much harder than the typical child in the class. So no wonder after 10 minutes they're looking out the window, or they're playing with their pen, or they're trying to be funny. They're just totally distracted. Why? They're mentally exhausted. So never think it's a choice. One of the assessments we've developed is to look at eye tracking, so you can actually see exactly what happens when a child is trying to read. Another test we've developed is to see how hard a child is working when he or she is trying to concentrate. We assume concentration is the same for all of us. Absolutely not. If someone, when they're listening, has to use this process here, they are working hundreds, if not thousands of times harder than the rest of us. We should be sympathetic to them, not criticize them for being lazy, not send them to the head teacher or blast them with all sorts of insults. That is terrible at several levels. A, it's wrong neurologically. B, it's incredibly confusing to the child to be blamed for something that he or she can have no influence on. So can you see why I get very frustrated that children, families are struggling that actually needn't? You know, there are so many things that could be understood, could be explained, that just isn't happening. So shyness is one of those things that it destroys a child's ability to make friends. What is shyness? It's actually a type of neurodiversity. So shyness for many is simply the incomplete development of verbal fluency. So you can have wonderful thoughts up here, but if they don't end up coming out of your mouth, no one ever hears them. No one ever knows that you've got them. I was speaking to a teenage boy just a few weeks ago, and you could hardly get a word out of his mouth, and his mother was there very concerned. He wasn't making friends, he was being misunderstood, he was quite bright, but a lot of people weren't seeing that. They were just focused on the fact he was desperately shy. Well, he actually went through a process to stimulate the cerebellum, to develop it, to complete its development, and his verbal fluency improved. Yes, when you develop that crucial bit of the brain, that brain within the brain called the cerebellum, when you stimulate that and develop it, it can naturally, permanently complete the development of key skills. And the key skill he desperately needed was his verbal fluency. So when I was talking to him about all of those wonderful thoughts he had in his mind that nobody ever sees, he can't speak them. In his case, he couldn't write them, because the very process that controlled his eye movement also controls his fingertips. So what you'll find is that those children that have poor reading, very often they'll hold their pen in a strange way, instead of the fingertips controlling writing, it'll be the whole hand controls writing. So look for that. If you're a parent or if you're a teacher, have a look at how your child holds his or her pen. And if they're moving the whole hand, that's a gross motor skill. If they're moving their fingertips and writing easily, then that same bit of the brain that controls fingertips also controls eye movement. You'll probably find reading is easy if writing is easy. So in this case of this lad I was talking to, he'd got brilliant ideas. So when I explained to him that all of those ideas were trapped because he couldn't get them out, he started to cry. And eventually explained to me it was like being very lonely, not being able to make friends, not being able to get thoughts out of his mouth. He said he'd been watching everyone else with thoughts that weren't as deep or as profound as his, speaking easily, and they made lots of friends and they got lots of good marks in the exams. And yet here he was, shy. He was transformed. His confidence went up dramatically, because we tend to think of confidence as being all psychological. Well, to me, you can explain confidence neurologically, because when things are effortless, you are confident. When you don't have to process in your prefrontal cortex, in your thinking brain, you are confident. So if you go through a process that develops the cerebellum, makes that room full of computer coders work better, make the skills better so they perform better, it means that less has to be processed here. There's less need for what psychologists call conscious compensation. When you don't have to work hard here, your confidence goes naturally right up and stays up. So look out for issues like shyness. I know it might not be high on the list of priorities. Put it high on the list of priorities, because shyness negatively impacts life, negatively impacts confidence. And in this post-COVID era, when we've got so many children to look at, I know that might be well down the list of priorities, but bring it up. It's important, and it gives a strong clue about what has happened in the development of that child. Do you know school can kill creativity? Children go to school at 3, 4, 5 years of age, whatever it is, and they go with a huge amount of creativity. The parent has nurtured them to give them opportunities to do things and be creative and express themselves. And as they go through school, increasingly the education system clamps down on that. You do it this way. This is the way you're being taught. And innovation and creativity is discouraged. Now, if that child has got symptoms of ADHD, guess what? You're clamping down the most important attributes they've got. So make sure your child is given every opportunity to be creative. And that means that every part of the brain can be in use. One of the issues we have with learning is that we do far too much rote learning. We do far too much teaching where the child is just expected to take in facts. We live in the world where we've got in our pockets Wikipedia, we've got access to all sorts of facts in our pockets, and presumably that will stay for the whole of our lives. Children don't need facts anymore, they need experiences. They need their creativity to be encouraged. And particularly if we've got a child that's got signs of ADHD, they're struggling with reading a bit, concentration isn't easy, their behaviour isn't brilliant, and so on. Two things: find out what has held back the development of their cerebellum, get that sorted out. And there's some wonderful stimulatory exercise programs exactly for that, ones that Dr. Hallowell supports very strongly these days. So go through that process, but also make sure they have a chance to learn and use their creativity. When we are being creative, all parts of our brain are being activated. When we're learning facts, only the hippocampus, one single part that takes the facts in and hopefully retains it. So if you try and remember someone's name, you know that there's a strong chance in a few months or a few years you'll have forgotten. But what you learn by experience, learn by doing, learn by using your creativity, all of your senses become involved. What you're seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, even feeling, all of those things become engaged, and the whole of your brain is activated. That's the best way to learn. And that's the way children with ADHD or other neurodiverse symptoms learn. They want every sense activated. So make sure that your child has that. And if they don't get it at school, make sure they get it at home. And as I said, teachers are amazing, but teachers aren't given the tools to resolve some of these developmental issues. So if the education system can't do it, they haven't got the tools, don't seem to have the interest in the neuroscience, then if you're a parent, you've got to do it. You've got to become a warrior parent. You've got to become a parent that says, I am going to solve the developmental issues that my child has got that's currently holding them back. I want them to have a brilliant life, and for them to have a brilliant life, it means every aspect of the brain must be developed to the full. You know, we live in a world where creating mental strength just isn't thought of as an option. But it absolutely is an option. We can create mental strength. We can increase mental capacity. And that means creating more intelligence. We don't have to live with what we were born with between our ears. We can do something about it. The brain is capable of almost infinite increase in the number of connections, the number of synapses made. And the more connections you have, the more intelligence you have, the more skills you have, the better memory you have, the more on top you feel. So just remember those two things that hold us down in terms of our mental capacity is one, the trauma that reduced the ability of the brain to create automatic processes. So more things have to happen by thinking about it. When you correct that, you increase your mental capacity. When you find the root cause of the traumas that create the triggers, and you stop those triggers happening, you stop the brain flooding with cortisol every time you become anxious or overwhelmed. And if you can stop that, you increase your mental capacity. So there's two fundamental things you can do to increase mental capacity. And the neuroscience has been around for a few decades now. It's not reaching the people that need it, but it could reach you. Study the cerebellum. Find out how you can stimulate the cerebellum. Every program, of course, needs to be unique because every brain is unique. But if it's your child you're worried about, or you, or your partner, then find out what you can do to naturally and permanently develop mental capacity in your brain. It's transformational. We were saying, why isn't this everywhere? If this was really true, every school would be doing it. Well, sadly not. The world's education systems, and I find it in every country I've studied, it's focused on excellent teaching instead of completion of development of the learning circuits in the brain, of the skill development circuits in the brain. So I'm afraid for now, it's down to warrior parents in the main. Schools very slowly are taking more and more interest, but they're so busy, they're so overwhelmed, so overloaded, they don't have them, the schools themselves, the education system doesn't seem to have the bandwidth to take on what would be transformational for so many children. That's completing the development of the skill development center in the brain, the cerebellum, so that that child naturally and completely becomes able to take information in, retain it, recall it. That's what would make a huge difference to our lives. So if school is unwittingly killing creativity, how serious is that? It's pretty serious. When you get into your career, when you start your work or you start a business, you need your creativity, you need your problem solving, you need your impatience and make it happen ability. So all of the symptoms that can be criticized in the education system can become priceless. I know so many folk at a high level that have got ADHD symptoms. They didn't do very well at school. Why? Because the school exam and test system in the main measures knowledge. It measures the ability to regurgitate. There's very little actually that is measuring creativity, the very thing that becomes priceless in your career. So just bear that in mind. Make the most of every symptom that's positive in life. And if teachers haven't got the time to do that, then parents absolutely must. So what's the risks to all of this? What's the risks to neurodiversity? Well, I've focused a lot on the potential upside of those with signs of neurodiversity, be it ADHD or even dyslexia. But for everyone that has a huge success, others go through life struggling, underachieving. What does that mean? You can't just leave this to luck or chance. You've got to do what it takes to grab the symptoms that are currently being under-recognized and make the most of them. You've got to nurture the child. You've got to find ways of developing the cerebellum. Now, I'm sure there are other things out there, but my folk have worked tirelessly to find ways of naturally developing the cerebellum. So there are processes there. I'm not saying it's the only way, but it's certainly a way that I know that works, because I meet so many who have been struggling in school. In fact, I was on the phone last night to one. Her mother brought her daughter on the phone. She'd been struggling with all sorts of things. She was shy, she was underachieving, she was misunderstood. And just in the last 3 months, suddenly teachers are seeing the real child. They're seeing what this child is capable of. Why? Because all we've done is naturally stimulated the cerebellum so that it can naturally and permanently create the very skills that makes that child show what she's capable of, what she's able to learn, what she knows. You know, many teachers think that they've failed children. When my daughter started to read for the first time in her 20s, I went and found her headmistress. Mrs. Chitty was her name. I went and found her and I said, I just want to thank you for what you did for Susie, because you taught Susie so much that you never knew was there. It was there, but it was hiding. Now we've done the work on the cerebellum, Susie's able to use that. And so Susie started to read without any more teaching. So teachers don't get the credit for everything they're getting into children. And children aren't able to use everything that teachers have got into them. So exams doesn't find it. Often life doesn't find it. So Mrs. Chitty, there was a tear in her eye when she said, I can see you're not joking, are you? Initially I thought you were being sarcastic. Now I can see you mean it. So she was thrilled. And I want teachers out there to know you are actually achieving far more than you're getting credit for. It's not your fault if the child can't take it in. And if they do get it in, it's not their fault that they can't get it out. Don't take a risk on your child if your child is showing any signs of struggling with aspects of learning or behavior or ability to get information out or shyness or even sport. If children are clumsy and can't play sport, don't want to play sport, not very good at sports, or even some not very good at team sports, these are all limitations caused by incomplete development of that critical junction box in the brain within the brain, the cerebellum. Do whatever it takes, because otherwise the child isn't going to reach his or her full potential. So we've got to change the concept. The concept that mental health is all negative, that mental health can't be changed, that we can't create mental strength, mental capacity, mental resilience. Yes, we can. And people have got to start to understand that. Maybe the neuroscientists have got to do more to share with everyone that needs it the fact that we can increase the number of connections in our brain. We can increase neuroplasticity at any age. I had an old lady in her 80s contact me once, and she was struggling. She'd struggled all her life. And she asked if she could do the exercises I'd been working on at her age, because in her case, she wanted to read and write for the first time in her life. Well, I thought she was going to hurt herself, but she said, life is so hurtful every day because I can't do what everybody else finds easy. I let her do them. And she was on breakfast television just a few months later, showing the world the first letter she'd written in her life. And 2 years later, her daughter rang me to tell me she's now reading and writing in 3 languages. So if you think you're too old, you're not. We now know how to create neuroplasticity at any age. And neuroplasticity means the brain's ability to make vital new connections. And that's the concept that isn't being generally known these days. You can increase neuroplasticity, you can increase and improve fundamental, important decisions, which gives you greater skills, gives you greater mental capacity, makes you feel on top of whatever it is that's causing you to feel anxious right now. So dealing with anxiety, to me, the best way to start is increase your mental capacity. To deal with neurodiversity, the best way to start is deal with whatever it is that's held back the development of your key skills. And you'll be amazed by what is possible. I think this is the greatest thing that's going to happen to mental health in the coming decades. Well, if you've got it in your family, don't wait. Be the warrior parent or be the warrior person that brings it to yourself, to your partner, to your children, whoever in your circle needs it. The changes are just phenomenal. You've got to see it to believe it. There's something that's not talked about very much, and that is with the undeniable increase in incidence of ADHD and other neurodiverse conditions. We're also seeing at the other end of the life spectrum an increase in dementia and Alzheimer's. And what is known is that the more neurodiversity, the greater the probability there is that such folk will have early onset dementia and other types of cognitive decline. So you have to wonder, does the dramatic increase in brain activity that happens when you've got underdeveloped of the cerebellum end up wearing the brain out prematurely? A lot of work needs to be done around this, but it's the kind of risk I wouldn't take.